Hello, everyone, and welcome to the World Affairs Forum's monthly speaker series. I'm Wendy Scratt, the Executive Director of the Forum, and for those of you not familiar with us, we are a Connecticut-based, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. Our work provides our members with access to a diverse group of global leaders, policy experts, and leading journalists. Every month, they share their insights on important global issues and strategic U.S. relationships around the world, and we have the chance to question and explore the topic with them. World Affairs Forum is also a part of the World Affairs Councils of America, a network of over 90 councils across the United States. We are so pleased and honored to have with us tonight Constanze Stelzenmüller, Senior Fellow, Foreign Policy, Center on the United States and Europe, Fritz Stern Chair on Germany and Transatlantic Relations at the Brookings Institution. She joins us this evening to discuss the end of the Merkel era and what it means for transatlantic relations. Before we get started, I want to encourage each of you attending tonight, if you have not already, and I know many have, to support the World Affairs Forum programming by purchasing a virtual membership online at worldaffairsforum.org. We recently extended the length of this membership, and now it grants access to all of our programs through September. With your help and support, we are excited to be planning our way back to in-person programming in October of this year, if all goes well. We will be answering questions in the second half of the program. Feel free to put your questions in the Q&A area at any time during the presentation or Q&A. Our program co-chair, Frank Bria, will be managing them behind the scenes, and he wants to know what you're thinking about. With that, I will pass the mic to Tom Krantz, our other program co-chair, who will be introducing our speaker this evening.
Thanks very much, Wendy. A bit of background on our speaker. Before holding her current position at Brookings, she held the Kissinger Chair on Foreign Policy and International Relations at the Library of Congress. She has in past years worked for the Marshall Fund of the United States, in the United States as well as in Germany. She was one of the editors for the political section of the German weekly Die Zeit. She's been a visiting researcher at Harvard Law at Grinnell College in Iowa. So she's had 3 long stints living in the United States, this being her 3rd. Her areas of expertise are in transatlantic foreign policy, NATO, the European Union's foreign, security, and defense policy, international law, and human rights. Dr. Stelzenmüller got her doctorate at the University of Bonn, as well as a master's degree in public administration from the Kennedy School at Harvard, and also a law degree at the University of Bonn. Dr. Stelzenmüller, thank you.
Well, thank you to both of you, to Wendy and to Thomas, for these very warm words of welcome and of introduction. I would obviously much rather be in Connecticut physically right now. I don't know about you all on this call, but I haven't left this town, Washington, D.C., for the past year, except for a day trip to the Chesapeake Bay in the middle of a thunderstorm. So frankly, it wasn't all that productive. So also Connecticut is just a very nice place, as I need hardly tell you. I've always been a huge fan of the World Affairs Councils, and I have managed in the past, pre-pandemic, obviously pre-pandemic past, to make something of a sport to hitting World Affairs Councils across the country. I was particularly proud that in 1 year I made it across the country from Rhode Island to Alaska, including Alaska, which was delightful. It was a long trip, but it was very enjoyable. And the thing is that every time I do one of these World Affairs Councils trips, I learn something from my hosts and from my audience, which is why I particularly miss the personal interaction. I've often in the past also asked my hosts where I should go, what I should see in their communities, whether they would like me to speak to a radio station or to a high school, and that often also worked out. And again, for me, these were like, missions to better understand America beyond the Beltway. So thank you very much for existing. Thank you very much for hosting people like me and for hosting me today. And I'm told you would like me to talk about Angela Merkel and the upcoming German elections and what that all means for Europe and for transatlantic relations, which I'll be happy to do. I'm a brief commercial interlude. I'm about to publish an essay on Angela Merkel's legacy in the next edition of Foreign Affairs. That, I gather, hits the newsstands on the 20th. But that, I think, should you have detailed questions about her legacy, one of the places that you could find an answer is there. Let me perhaps start with where we are right now in German politics, which on April 7th, 2021 is in many ways a very strange place and not one that I in my adult political life can recall having been in. For one, we're still in the middle of a pandemic that in recent weeks and months has turned from whose management was admired by all the world to one that is bewildering and infuriating Germans and bemusing observers and friends of Germany. We also have federal elections on September 26th, mandated by law. And the fact that we are having to organize an election campaign in the middle of a pandemic means that this election campaign is like no other. There is practically no possibility of physical electioneering, no pressing the flesh, no this wonderful American phrase, no gripping and grinning. And frankly, I think the online version of grip and grin just ain't it. It doesn't have the same effect. The other thing that's exceptional is that we're in the waning months of the second longest serving chancellor in German post-war history, Angela Merkel. And if we should have longer coalition negotiations like we did last time around in 2017, if they last as long as they did last time, which was 5 months, again, unprecedented in German history, then she would indeed become the longest serving German chancellor because she would be the head of the caretaker government that runs the country while the coalition parties negotiate, just so you keep that in mind. And right now, the political scenery, and I'll come to that in a second, is so wide open that I think that's a distinct possibility. The other thing that's unique here is that Angela Merkel is the first chancellor to leave of her own accord. All of the predecessors were voted out or either lost at the ballot box or lost in a vote of no confidence, like Willy Brandt, and also left under a shadow of one kind or another. In particularly, this is something I note in my essay in Foreign Affairs, the three great ones, Adenauer, the first chancellor, Willy Brandt, who went to his knees in Warsaw, very important for the generation of my parents, who were war children, and Helmut Kohl, the chancellor of German unity and the chancellor of the Euro. All these men left office under a shadow and against their own will. And of Angela Merkel, it's pretty well known that she didn't really want to run for a fourth term. It's thought, at least that is what Ben Rhodes wrote in his book, the speechwriter of Barack Obama. I just thought that it was Obama who persuaded her that because of Trump, she needed to run again. Europe needed one senior politician with a firm hand. I'm inclined to think that was a pretty shrewd assessment. And the other thing that was unusual about this political period is that she tried to be the first German chancellor to, as it were, take care of her own succession. She had a chosen successor as party leader, the current defense minister, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, who sort of squeaked in at a regular pre-pandemic party convention over an older, more conservative guy who is actually a businessman, has been working for BlackRock Germany, Friedrich Merz, who I think it is not unfair to say has a high opinion of himself. And the quite large group in the CDU that felt that he should have won, I think, spent a lot of time in the following year doing what they could to undermine her stature. I confess that I have mixed feelings about Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer. I think that she's a great defense minister. She's very popular in the Pentagon and in London. But I think she was, while she tried very hard to be a good party leader, she was, on the whole, this was a place where her relative lack of experience on the national level showed. And so at some point in February 2020, I think it was, she resigned. One of the idiosyncrasies of this current situation is that we are less than 6 months out from the election, and the party that's leading in the polls, Angela Merkel's Conservatives, does not have a chancellor candidate yet. It has a chancellor candidate presumptive in the form of Mr. Armin Laschet, who is the minister-president of, I think, the most populous state in Western Germany, in North Rhine-Westphalia, and who I think I went to law school with, more or less contemporaneously, in Bonn in the 80s. So I can say, I think I know the atmosphere that he grew up in, because I grew up in it too, at least, when my diplomat parents were in the country. And certainly 5 years at this law school taught me a great deal about this milieu. And I think it has to be said that Armin Laschet so far has simply not managed to convince either his party or Germans on the whole. Every single poll shows that. I think there are a variety of reasons for that I can go into at greater length in Q&A maybe, but I will just say this, that I think his demeanor, his behavior, his opinions suggest that while he might be quite a good minister-president, which is the equivalent of governor, I'm not sure that he's ready for prime time yet. And certainly he doesn't have any notable experience in foreign and security policy, and that has also shown in some of his recent pronouncements. So is there an alternative? Well, there is a dark horse, which is if you can call it that, because this dark horse is in the media every day, and talking about what it would be like to be a chancellor candidate every day while refusing to answer the question whether he wants to do this. And this is, of course, Markus Söder, the very self-confident minister-president of Bavaria. The two have said that there will be a decision between now and Pentecost, which I think is at the end of May. I think it might be the 23rd of May. So we've got, we've got a month more to go. And frankly, I think all Germans will be very grateful when this is decided, because it is high time. The CDU is also currently in trouble, the Conservatives, because for two reasons. One is incompetence and the other is corruption, not the kind of thing that you want to have as a problem in your election campaign, particularly if you're the poll frontrunner. And the degree to which it is a problem is currently visible in those poll numbers going down and down all the time to the benefit of another party, and I'll come to that in a second. The incompetence problem is by that I mean simply the confusion and backtracking and mixed signaling around the management of the pandemic, where Merkel does not have, as chancellor, the competence to give orders to the governors. Her job is to essentially herd the cats, but the cats are all in electioneering mode and want to be the most, the most opening, the most welcoming, the most tourism friendly, the most whatever. And as a result, infection rates have been going up again. Vaccination rates are far behind those in the US or in Israel, and none of this is looking good. And on top of that have come a couple of revelations about corruption scandals, both in the CDU and the Bavarian sister party CSU. Most of these from younger backbenchers, but also with one or two extremely senior CSU power politicians, a former justice minister, and a former deputy party head. This ain't good, and it's showing in the polls. So who does this benefit? You've heard of them, the Greens. The Greens were once, in 1989, I think, or no, wait, in the 70s, in the late 70s, when I was still going to school, a wild and woolly anti-nuclear, anti-military, pacifist, ecological party that was voted into the Bundestag with folks wearing hand-knitted sweaters and sneakers. They have come a very long way. In many ways, they have become the receptacle, or they look like the receptacle of the German, the very large swath of German population that likes to think of itself as both sort of centrist and kind of progressive. They've cast off, at least again in appearance, their sort of wild and woolly characteristics, and they have a quite attractive younger couple of leaders. They're not a couple in real life, they're co-leaders of the party, with Robert Habeck, a former minister in the northern state of Schleswig-Holstein, and Annalena Baerbock, a legislator who's also an expert in foreign and security policy. And they too have not decided yet which of the two is supposed to be chancellor candidate. Now, in previous decades, nobody wanted to know whom the Greens would field as chancellor candidate because they stood no chance of ever being asked to field the chancellor. This election, that's different for the first time in history. Because at this point, the CDU's polls, which were at 38 at the beginning of the pandemic, are now somewhere between 28 and 25, and the Greens are between 22 and 23. That, for the first time, opens the possibility that there might be a Green-led government. There is precedent for this in the also very large and wealthy state of Baden-Württemberg, where a popular Green incumbent minister-president has just won re-election. This to the Greens is heady stuff. The leadership couple are now making pressure on the CDU by saying they're going to decide earlier, thereby showing up their weakness in decision-making. But because the Greens are exceedingly popular here in Washington, because they're seen as anti-Nord Stream 2, the famous Gazprom pipeline, they're seen as pro-humanitarian military deployments, and in general, Washington thinks that it is in love with the Greens. I would caution you that, that Washington maybe not be looking quite closely enough for two reasons. One is that the Greens have a very yeasty and pretty wild and woolly party base, and they have a very strong left wing. And the left wing is by no means inclined to follow the more centrist leaders on a number of points. And I've been close to some of these debates. I can go into that in Q&A. The other reason is that the Greens have intelligently and successfully avoided taking positions on a number of issues, on all the key issues really that a party that expects to field a chancellor has to take positions on. Taxes, budgets, military deployments, Green positions on all that are, we'll tell you when it's time to tell you. My prediction is if the polls develop the way they're going, and once they've made their decision who will be their chancellor, they can't escape that anymore. And then I think we'll see some pretty interesting open discussions. Now, again, one of the Washington suppositions is what this means is that we're going to have a Black-Green coalition, either with a conservative chancellor or a Green chancellor. I would warn you of that. I don't think that is a certainty either. And while all the other parties are doing badly, the Merkel's coalition, grand coalition partners, the Social Democrats, who have, I have to say, decent and capable people as ministers and in the ministries and in the parliament, have from their past history where they fielded chancellors like Willy Brandt and Gerhard Schröder. I'm a fan of one, not of the other, as you would imagine. And I hope you don't have to guess which one. they have lost support in the German voting landscape, and really can no longer be called a people's party as they used to when they got voting percentages of more than 40%. They're now closer to 15, which I have to say is kind of tragic. Then you have the next one is the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, the hard right opposition party, which is currently under surveillance and investigation by the German Domestic Intelligence Service for its connections with neo-Nazi movements, identitarians, conspiracy theorists, the German version of QAnon, the Querdenker, all for good reason. And then you have, the liberals around 10%, Die Linke, the successor party to the East German communists, also at around 10%. I'm saying all that because there is one other option, which would send the Angela Merkel's Christian Democrats into the opposition. And that is what is called a traffic light coalition, led by the Greens, with the Social Democrats and the Liberals. It's also not completely unthinkable that there could be what is called a Jamaica coalition, because those are the colors of the Jamaican flag, black, green, and yellow, yellow being the color of the Liberals. Sorry, I'm going into much more detail than you want to know. But the reason I'm laying all this out is to say to you that never in my memory has the potential outcome of a German national election been so wide open. And that will have significant repercussions for Germany's ability to act, make decisions, and to lead in Europe and in transatlantic relations at a time when that, I think, has been more necessary than in a very long time, if you look at what is developing around us in terms of crises and potential crises. And let me just say this: if, for example, the coalition mathematics are unclear on election night, and again, the German tradition has been that all the results were in at 9 p.m. and you knew who was going to negotiate with whom that evening and who was going to become chancellor. That has stopped being the case. And if we have yet another situation of 5 months of negotiations, and in the 4th month, the Liberals marching out and saying, nah, this whole Jamaica thing, we're not going to do it. We don't like this. We may only have 10%, but you know what? We're not getting enough concessions. And then the other parties are forced to regroup. Then that would bring us from September of this year into the spring of 2022, when the French have elections. And the reason I mention this is that currently in the French polls, Marine Le Pen, the leader of the French hard right, is polling neck to neck and at some points ahead of the current incumbent President Emmanuel Macron. And I think if Marine Le Pen won the French presidential elections, that would be earth-shattering for Europe and also for the transatlantic relationship. It would be an encouragement to all the populists in Europe who are currently on the defensive. It would be cheered on by some of the anti-EU populists here in Washington, D.C. and the US more generally. And I think we would wake up in a changed Europe. So that is why, that is a big reason why I think Germany would be best advised to vote for clarity on September 26th, and to make sure that there is a German government in place that can take decisions, that can act, and that can, if necessary, do damage limitation and mitigation if the French elections go what I'm going to very freely say, the wrong way. I'm going to stop here because I only really wanted to talk for 20 minutes. I'm sure you have questions to ask about all sorts of things, foreign and security policy, immigration, the AfD. I am at your disposal to tell you anything you'd like to know. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Frank, you want to go ahead? You're still on mute. You're still on mute, Frank.
You're on mute. Yes, there you are. Yep, yes, we got it.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Frank. I'm sorry I'm running a little late.
That's all right.
We have a ton of questions, but I want to make sure there are areas that we do not, if there are areas you want us to refrain from, like if there are issues you don't want us to
Just
ask
throw
about,
them at me and I will say whether I'm competent to answer them or not.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. Because, for example, like one of my colleagues was asking, you know, in the US, we're spending a lot of time thinking about, you know, how do we make US employment more family friendly? And I think Germany has one of the most progressive and most thoughtful policies when it comes to work-life balance, as well as helping women stay engaged in the workforce, which is such an important issue here in the United States. And are there elements of that policy that we should try to learn from or to adopt when we're trying to develop a more
Why don't we take a couple and then I will try and sort of group them together. How about that?
Perfect. The other thing is, I don't know where Germany stands on this, but some of the common themes that we've covered in prior presentations have to do with cryptocurrencies. And, you know, I know that China has adopted it. I know France has come out very strongly in favor of a cryptocurrency backed by the government. Where does Germany stand in that conversation? I don't know if it's pro or against, but I can see that question surfacing. So I don't know if that's an area you want to cover or an area you prefer to stay out of.
I actually don't know anything about cryptocurrency.
Okay, so we'll keep out of that. Okay.
It's cryptical to me. Okay. Sorry, that was terrible.
No, not at all. And then the other common question that seems to keep coming up has to do with ESG, you know, the whole ESG movement. Are there elements of ESG that I know that Germany's done a wonderful job on the E piece, but those other two where we're talking about social, which has to do with board diversity, you know, gender diversity, you know, just diversity in general, as well as governance, seem to be big issues here in the US. Are those two elements important in Germany? And if so, how are they dealing with it?
I'm sorry, that's an acronym I don't know. Remember, I do foreign and security policy. What's an ESG? Environmental standards?
We'll keep out of it. No, we can talk offline. I don't want to, that's why I wanted to make sure those questions were, if they were not appropriate, I didn't want to put you on the spot with those.
Sure.
Okay.
I'll just say what I know about. Okay. How about, what else is there?
Privacy and security. I think Germany is a leader on terms of, you know, creating a privacy framework, and the US is definitely trying to adopt it. Anything that you can shed light on in terms of the conflict, because we've spent a lot of time, our people are always worrying about what is the next cyber threat, and, you know, not only from a cyber warfare perspective, but also from just, you know, is there need for greater regulation specifically around US tech firms? And if so, are there proposals currently in Germany that we should be looking at very seriously?
Okay. A lot of that goes into stuff that I'm not an expert on. And because I'm a lawyer by training, I believe in precision. And in not talking about stuff where a lack of precision is a dead giveaway that you are talking off the top of your head.
Perfect.
On US employment being family friendly, well, I'll tell you what, or rather the German employment being so family friendly, that's a recent change, if I may say so. I grew up in a country and went to university in a country that was notoriously unfriendly to working women. And that was a tradition that went back to the Nazi era. There is the German expression Rabenmutter, which also goes back straight to the 30s. A raven mother is one who works and leaves her children in a creche. That was changed by a number of things. A, reunification. We suddenly had 30 million East Germans, about half of whom were women, all of whom had worked and had their children in a creche and had said, you know what, working gives me independence. That really, I mean, that was sort of one of the social innovations that came from the East. There weren't many, but this was one of them. And my East German friends, you know, still think that their mothers were more emancipated than my generation of mothers, of West German mothers, and they're probably right. I mean, obviously there were some other constraints and things that they suffered from, but nobody disapproved of them for wanting to work. It was Ursula von der Leyen, the current EU Commission president, who as family minister, with encouragement from Merkel, instituted a much more generous, two things, more generous parental leave, which was available also to men, fathers, and basic right to a place for children in creches. That had, I think, a very significant impact on the labor market, and made it easier for women to work, but also for families to distribute work and to be more flexible in planning. That I think is genuinely a good deal. And when I see how my American friends, have a baby and are basically at work, back at work a day later, that to me is, frankly, seems a little harsh. And again, I think American women can multitask with, are world-class multitaskers, but it seems to me that there is actually a great deal of utility in giving folks parental leave. I have nothing to say about cryptocurrencies or ESG. And on privacy and security, I have to tell you, again, this is a field where you really have to go into the details. Germans have a distinct preference for privacy rights and for taxation of global corporations. I get the distinct impression that the Biden administration is inclined to look at that favorably. I think there could be grounds for agreement there. That said, there's also a sense that the German market is a tad overregulated. I think, there's what strikes me as likely is that there's going to be a meeting in the middle. If you want to see more, I was part of a working group at Harvard at the German Council on Generation, German Council on Foreign Policy, DGAP, that in January published a report called Stronger Together, which you'll find on the Harvard website or that of the DGAP, and which has a chapter by me on democracy and a chapter by David Sanger of the New York Times and Catherine Kluver of Harvard on privacy and technology, which I recommend to you for further reading. They know much more about this than I do. And I see that you have more questions. If I saw correctly, there was something about Ukraine. Why don't you throw 2 or 3 more at me?
Yeah, so do you mean now here, or do you want me to do you want to go over these, or did you want to go
whatever you want? I suggest that we maybe group them by topic.
Yeah.
Okay, I agree.
Frank, if I may join in, what about Germany looking eastward, Ukraine and Turkey, directly east on the other side? I saw another question and answer on the Baltics. So why don't we go over Germany's eastern flank?
Okay, sure. I am on somewhat firmer ground on that.
I thought so.
So right now, the most concerning of all these, although that has repercussions on the Baltics as well, is the heating up of the conflict in eastern Ukraine, where it's very clear that the Russians are directly involved, have brought major elements, supplies, weapons, materiel, and troops to the theater, and where the very large majority of ceasefire violations comes from the Russians, not from the Ukrainians. There is also a distinct uptick in Russian disinformation, which suggests that somehow the Ukrainians started it, or that the Ukrainians are doing more than the Russians, or are doing it to the same degree. That is incorrect. This is provoked by the Russians, and the blame, I think, lies squarely with the Russians. Nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that European capitals and the White House are deeply concerned about this. And I'll talk about this and talk about why in a moment. It's ironic. We've been fighting about this damn Gazprom pipeline, of which I disapprove, but which is, for which there are pragmatic solutions available. But in reality, there are much larger issues at stake. And that is really the future of Russian governance on the Eurasian continent, and what that means for the safety and security of Europe and the transatlantic relationship. And I would say without hesitation that the Kremlin is currently attempting to test the cohesion of Europe and the Transatlantic Alliance, the cohesion and the resolve. I think that the less likely outcome, although one should never speculate too energetically on these things, but I think it's the less likely outcome that there is a Russian incursion with large numbers of materiel and troops into Ukrainian territory. And I think it's even less likely that there would be a deliberate Russian incursion into NATO member state territory, e.g. the Baltics. For the simple reason that the Kremlin has basically had surprisingly, not to anybody else, surprisingly bad experiences with the illicit acquisition of problematic real estate in its western neighborhood. The Kremlin has tried this in Georgia in 2008 and in Ukraine in 2014 and thereafter. And I think genuinely did not expect to get as much blowback from the West as it did, including from Germany. And I think if anybody has their head screwed on straight in the Kremlin still, they're not going to do that. That leaves, however, the risk of accidental escalation, which is not inconsiderable, and which if I were in any military staff, I'd be currently losing a lot of sleep over. And that's frankly bad enough. That's not good news. And that is, and even if it's quote unquote only in Eastern Ukraine, and I'm, say this in several quote unquotes because people are dying there, human beings are dying there, and that should not leave us cold. It has consequences, obviously, for the stability of NATO and the EU, for the security of the Eastern European member states adjacent to Ukraine. It has an impact, of course, on a highly volatile situation in Belarus, where you also have a dictator hanging on for dear life, and Alexander Lukashenko, supported only by the Kremlin, and who has been engaging in a really brutal crackdown on his own population. And of course, the nasty truth is that the Russian population appears to have become similarly disaffected with Putin, not least because of the activities of Alexei Navalny, the dissident, who published a damning indictment in form of a 2-hour-long video of a sort of late Roman type sort of pleasure palace on the Black Sea that belongs to Putin. This is a very serious situation, which I think, as far as I'm concerned, puts the whole kerfuffle about Nord Stream 2 into its proper place, which is that it is a secondary or tertiary tactical problem, which, given the larger strategic issues at stake, ought to be resolved firmly, pragmatically, and generously. And generously means movement on all sides. I think that the hawks are perfectly capable of screwing this one up, in which case they're helping the Kremlin and their populist friends all over the world. But that's just me. So that's what I have to say about Eastern Europe. Now, on Turkey, some of you will have seen the images of the visit by Charles Michel, the head of the European Council, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, to Turkey, where they were received in a sort of throne room by Erdogan, who seated Mr. Michel to his right-hand side and had Ms. von der Leyen sit on a sofa, which was an obviously intentional insult to her, and one which Charles Michel should not have accepted. So I'd say in terms of tactical victories, that's one for Erdogan, but it certainly hasn't made him in any way more popular in European capitals. And the reality is that Erdogan himself, like Putin, is in a situation where his power assets and his grip on power is not entirely as clear as it used to be. And it seems to me personally that the Europeans and the Americans have leverage that they have so far chosen to not use. I would be quite happy with telling Mr. Erdogan where to get off. But that's me. So Turkey obviously is also an issue for Germany, not just because of the large German-Turkish diaspora, but also because of the refugee agreement, the bilateral refugee agreement between Germany and Turkey, by which Turkey accepted, against the payment of, I think, 2 million euros, to retain refugees in Turkey rather than letting them leave the country and take the Balkans route all the way up to Germany and elsewhere. For some reason, that's often read by Merkel's critics as somehow Erdogan having Europe and Germany by the throat. Again, it seems to me that if Erdogan wants those 2 billion, he's going to do something for it. So I think that this kind of leverage is two ways. And I think that Erdogan is really not in a position to be quite as feisty as he is behaving. But again, it would be helpful. It would be very helpful if European capitals and Washington could find common positions on these things. That would make, I think, a singularly clear impression on people like Putin and Erdogan. I think that would be very helpful. And I hope that we will not stand in each other's way over this, because there's not much time to lose.
There are 2 questions having to do with COVID, so I'll throw those both to you. The first one is has a bit of commentary in it. Why has Germany and EU fumbled the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine? And the second has to do with the economic relation. The ECB has run very loose monetary policy in response to COVID. Germans are famously allergic to inflation. Does this contrast affect German politics today? And if so, how?
Those are both very good questions. On the COVID fumble, I'll just say that my colleague and the head of the Center on the US and Europe at Brookings, Thomas Wright, who's really a brilliant guy, is just put the finishing touches on the galleys of a book on the pandemic management that he's written together with Colin Kahl, who, as some of you may know, is currently being interrogated by the US Senate because he's nominated as the chief policy guy in DoD. It looks as though, I think that this nomination may now go through. The Germans are bemused by this as well, and I think that this shows up the underpreparedness of the EU and of the European nation state. Germany here is not the only one, but certainly in terms of its size and wealth, probably the most important one and the one with the greatest responsibilities towards others. It shows how unprepared we are for dealing with a state of exception. And as a trained constitutional lawyer, for me, this raises all sorts of interesting constitutional legal issues. And for a German, obviously, there's always a little alarm bell inside your head when you hear state of exception, Ausnahmezustand, because that was so viciously abused by the Nazis. The German Basic Law of 1949, our constitution that we wrote together with help and inspiration from the Americans, did not include emergency rules, unlike many other Western constitutions. And we added some very haphazardly, and they were insanely badly drafted in 1968, because it was feared that maybe, the West German Republic might be taken over by rioting students. That is, A, it never happened, B, that's not the problem that you have in a pandemic. The problem that you need to resolve is how much emergency power you want to give to the federal executive, how you want to circumscribe it, and how you want to end it. And that's not something we gave much thought to, and that is one of the sort of great underlying sort of constitutional order decisions and debates that we're currently having, and I think decisions that we might need to make in the future, of how to give more definition to that so we don't have to reinvent the wheel in the case of the next pandemic, which is certain to come. But it's a very serious question. And so the status quo of the status quo, as I said, is one where existing emergency laws are not applicable. So what is applicable, as I mentioned earlier, is that public health is the competency of the member states, and the federal chancellor has at best a right and responsibility to cajole, nudge, cudgel, bully, that kind of thing. But that's sort of what what the chancellor has in her toolbox for peacetime. In an emergency, when you need to move very effectively and quickly, the whole cajoling, nudging, and bullying thing, can get a little exhausting. And it seemed that this was working quite well for Merkel for a while. And then everybody got opening fever, and everybody started thinking about their election chances. And the cats decided to be unherded. And so, it would appear that one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is German federalism really set up for this kind of national public emergency? And the answer at this time of thinking is probably not. So that's one thing. On the ECB and the loose monetary policy, well, to whoever asked that question, it will not have escaped you that in the past summer, the German conservatives jumped over their shadow, as we say in Germany, by giving up their resistance to one of their most firmly and religiously held tenets of faith, which was that never ever must the European Union be allowed to borrow money on public markets, because that would be the end of civilization as we know it. That would be moral hazard, all sorts of things that Germans don't like. And so it was indeed a historic moment when Merkel's Christian Democrats and she herself decided to endorse a European recovery program, over an enormous sum of money, I think $780 billion, which obviously is dwarfed by what President Biden is doing right now, but by European standards, or by your and my press standards, I presume, unless everybody on the call here is a billionaire, is still quite a lot of money. And if you are billionaires, fund think tanks. No, sorry, that was a joke. But this was a major, a really historic decision. And I'm sorry to say, I would much rather not have to admit it, that it is currently being challenged before the German Constitutional Court by the people who always come and challenge these things, the nationalists. And they're not necessarily even the AfD nationalists, there are enough of those in the conservative camp. In fact, I think the last guy who did that was was Peter Gauweiler, who I think sued against the Greek bailout package in 2010, and who, not very ironically, is one of the senior Bavarian politicians I was mentioning earlier, who is now sort of under a cloud because of a suspicion of corruption. What a surprise. Again, I think the German emphasis here was that this was a one-off and it was because of a historic crisis. I don't think anybody is going to sign off on permission for the ECB to do fundraising on the money markets, on a regular basis anytime soon. But that's where we are in the ECB. Again, other people are more expert on this than I am. What else can I answer?
There are two questions that relate to the uncertainty of the outcome of the election and then German policy in relation to that. The first is, the German election is likely to be less decisive in outcome. How will this impact the EU itself? Brexit seemingly challenged the primacy of the euro. If Germany has more of a coalition government, will it hurt the EU overall to have less authoritative German leadership? Mm-hmm. And then the other there was one on Iran, or And yeah, with the upcoming, will the upcoming election have any bearing on the effort to reestablish the multi-party agreement with Iran? Is there optimism in Germany that the Obama-era agreement can be revived given the change in leadership in the US? And then also staying in the Middle East, Biden administration has apparently signaled a lack of interest in investing energies in pursuing a two-party solution for Israel-Palestine. Where does this issue rank in the Germans' international list of priorities? If the US does not push the issue, is Germany likely to allow the status quo to continue?
Yeah, all interesting questions. I think, frankly, on Israel-Palestine, I think there's little appetite anywhere. And I mean, this is sad for the Palestinians, but given the fact that Mr. Netanyahu is yet again tasked with forming a government in Jerusalem, you know, you don't exactly have a willing Israeli partner. You also don't really have a constructive Palestinian partner if we think about it more closely. The greater concern for both the Biden administration and European capitals are the power shifts in the Middle East. And yeah, in many ways, the so-called Abraham Accords, the sort of bilateral peace treaties between Israel and a number of Gulf Arab states were, as far as I'm concerned, merely the acknowledgement of what everybody knew, which is that there had been over a decade of energetic diplomacy between the Israelis and these states for the purpose of hedging in Iranian hegemonic ambitions. Yeah. So that's not, you know, I mean, you know, that was not news to anybody. The greater question, I think, that remains on the table and that is unresolved is whether the Israelis, the Gulf Arabs, and the Saudis would think of this new constellation of alliances as the makings of a war coalition against Iran. And I think that they had greater friends of such a framework in the Trump White House than they would have in the Biden White House. That said, I think nobody, you know, I think the days where anybody in Europe or in America was naive about Iranian intentions went away a very long time ago. The question is, what is it possible to get the Iranians to the table for? Is it just re-entry into the JCPOA? Because, I mean, the position there was always that's only the beginning and we need to talk about missiles and regional activities, including the support of terrorism by proxies. And that's, you know, that's where it's at, and that's where it's at even more than now. And the Iranians have, of course, also in the interim have had time to do stuff with enrichment and capabilities. And of course, foregoing the JCPOA meant foregoing the very intrusive and very real inspection rights that the International Atomic Agency, the IAEA, had in the past. So we actually no longer know. We're not in a position to know stuff that we don't know from satellite and other intelligence, which I would say is concerning. So I think nobody has illusions about what's possible with Iran. Again, there is a not insignificant risk in the region of accidental conflagration of one kind or another. And I think it behooves all of us to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Same as with the bloody pipeline, of which I reiterate, I am distinctly hostile to. I wish, you know, somebody would just come and take it away. But in other words, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as far as I'm concerned, at this point, is I think, you know, I think the parties are doomed to the status quo unless they themselves have any other ideas, because we have bigger issues that are more concerning, that are more strategic, and that are capable of erupting with much greater damage. That's the concern here. Now, the German elections in the EU, well, I'd already said that if we have, you know, if we have a prolonged period of political inward lookingness, if that's a word, probably not, in Germany, a lack of clarity, a lack of action and decision-making from Berlin, at a time when the French are giving serious thought to electing the daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen as their president, which would be unfortunate, to repeat myself. Does that do good things to the EU? Probably not. The tragic irony being here that this Biden administration is maybe the administration that most clearly understands what useful power assets the EU brings to bear. Note that I'm emphasizing useful and power and asset. I'm not saying, you know, the EU is lovely and it's about motherhood and apple pie and America should love it because we're great. That's not the point. But in a world that's marked by the weaponization of economic interdependence, the trade and regulatory muscle of the EU is a significant source of leverage that is not just useful to American purposes, but potentially essential for their pursuit. And I think that this administration knows that with exquisite clarity, which is why it's also in Washington's interest for us to get our act together. And I have to say, I would be very upset. I mean, I'm supposed not to be upset, right? I'm supposed to be sort of equable about these things, but I'm afraid they make me angry because I'm worried that we don't, you know, that we, I mentioned earlier that the Russians are testing us, the Chinese are testing us even more. We haven't talked about China at all, and I don't want us to leave this conversation without mentioning that. Europeans and Americans have decided to sanction the Chinese government because of what is very obviously a genocide going on against the Uyghurs. If you have any doubts, read the very long story by Rafi Khachaturian in this week's New Yorker, which is absolutely harrowing. And the Chinese responded to what was in many ways a slap on the wrist with a sharp left hook, sanctioning not just a couple of European politicians, Germans among them, but also Europe's probably best China think tank, Merck's in Berlin. And clearly the Chinese are not taking this, not just not taking this lying down, they're also testing our cohesion and our resolve. And again, I think it would be foolhardy to assume that we as Europeans, or for that matter, the United States, are capable in an interconnected world of responding adequately to this kind of probing of our vulnerabilities on our own. I think I would be very well advised. And again, I think given what is at stakes, it seems to me that the arguments for overcoming what I would call the narcissism of minor difference and working together to make it clear that we will not be pushed around, those arguments strike me as overwhelming. I can only hope that they strike people in capitals who actually have decisions to make, unlike me, as overwhelming as well. Anyway, we're at the 6 o'clock mark. I've still got a little time if you have, but if you want, I mean, if you have more questions that I haven't answered, I'm happy to answer one or two more.
I'd like to hear what the perspective is, given the differences of the parties and the non-clarity of the election, how NATO is viewed the relationship to NATO? I know that that was a real issue, obviously, in Trump's election, and I'm wondering where it stands now.
Sure, that's a very good question. Well, we learned from John Bolton's book that President Trump was much closer to actually taking the United States out of NATO than any of us had thought. And I think that, again, while the Biden administration knows why NATO is necessary, I think if I may permit myself one, and this is not meant as an unfriendly critique, but it is a critique of what I think the evolving worldview of the Biden administration is that while its worldview on what China's intentions are and what should be done about that are quite precise, and these insights are measurable by the seniority and the experience of the administration officials put in charge of these issues, you can't say the same of Europe and Russia. It is not clear to me that the Biden administration really has a distinct sense of the future of the relationship with Russia and of what kind of Europe it wants. In other words, I think the Biden administration has a sense of, European status quo is good, we like it, we want them, we need them. But I would be reassured if I thought that there was somebody of the weight of a Kurt Campbell, who is the Asia czar in the White House and the NSC, in charge of the Europe dossier. Now, once Victoria Nuland is confirmed as the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, the number 3 position in the State Department, definitely you have a very heavy hitter and who's very knowledgeable about European and Russian affairs in that position. And I can't see the Senate not confirming her, frankly. But I have immense respect for her. But it's still not entirely clear to me that I think none of us have done our homework on this, that we know what to do with a Russian Kremlin whose grip on its own power assets is beginning to weaken, and what that could imply for the future of governance in Russia, and what that means for the security risks of Russia's neighbors. And that's my problem with NATO. I mean, I am fine with NATO talking about China, it should. And yes, China is an aggressive, very confident actor in the European theater. So that makes it a NATO issue. But my feeling is that we haven't talked enough about what Europe and, how much do we need to worry about Russia? And again, we have issues in the Caucasus, we have issues with Belarus, we have issues in Ukraine. And of course, with the Russians meddling in the Middle East and Africa and in other places, and otherwise cozying up to the Chinese. I think there's absolutely, all those are reasons to have some very firm conversations with the Kremlin.
Yeah, one issue that may come up, because we do have some conservative members, is the whole issue with China and Taiwan. And will that drag Europe and the US into a conflict situation?
Well, I mean, I think again, I think what I would like to say to your conservative members is that I do think, and I watch this very closely, that the thinking not just on Russia but also on China in Berlin has evolved quite noticeably. I mean, yes, and here, to my regret, I have to say that Merkel has been the holdout. Merkel is the one who's sort of doing very traditional German chancellor balancing type stuff, whereas there has been intense criticism of this coming from the Bundestag and not just from the the usual suspects. In fact, the Social Democrats have been sort of very, very firm on China issues, written some really interesting papers. I think that also most, what's happening with Germany and the German-Chinese bilateral relationship is in reality what happened with Russia about a decade ago, which is that the chancellery decided that this was a commercial / trade / economic relationship, and therefore was content to have sort of powerful industry federations take the policy lead and sort of throw this to them so as to be left alone on other issues. And the German exporters and investors, industry, have been were burned in Russia a decade ago and are now being burned in China. That's when policy changes. And I think we're now in this slightly ironic position that industry is saying, we need stronger protections here. And the chancellery is the holdout. And so I think on the economic side, I think there's actually a great deal of overlap between views in the White House, the NSC, and in European capitals, including Berlin. And there is a great deal of work that could be done. There were two worries in Berlin, one of which I think isn't happening and one I think is still out there. The first worry was that there would be a sort of call for Trump-style decoupling. You know, America can try to decouple, even so I think, you know, it would attempt to do so at unconscionable cost, which is why the Trump administration never really got around to that. There was enough resistance, frankly, from domestic corporate actors. But, you know, the Europeans and the Germans in particular are some of the most open economies on earth, and decoupling would be suicidal. It's not an available strategic option. So where we can find policy overlap is in mitigation, is in repatriating, you know, critical infrastructure or supply chains, that kind of thing. But there's, I think, a great deal of work that could be done there. The open question still, and one that I think genuinely worries Berlin, is whether, and other European capitals for that matter, is whether the US-Chinese relationship is heading for a military confrontation. And the sub-chapter to that is whether the Chinese could try and force it over Taiwan, which I think would be a big mistake. But there too, I think that there has been a sort of strategic rethinking in European capitals, and you can see that most visibly in the fact that the capitals have all been publishing Indo-Pacific strategy papers, in which they link up commercial trade, investment, regulatory, and security issues, and where they sort of essentially make it clear that they see that they have concerns not just about Chinese behavior in Europe or in Europe's periphery, but also in its own neighborhood, to the extent that that accepts either, you know, democratic movements like the one in Hong Kong, democratically run states like Taiwan, but also trade routes. And I think it's the combination of these things that is leading to a rethink in European capitals. And I mean, you may laugh at this when I say this. The Germans have just sent a frigate in into the Pacific. We don't have a lot of frigates, so that's actually a big deal. And it took a huge amount of work in Berlin for that damn frigate to leave the harbor. And of course, it's political signaling. But for Germany to send a frigate to the Pacific is a big, big deal. Yeah. And so I think that sort of the mood is shifting there quite distinctly. And I think one of the reasons why the Chinese are currently so, you know, thumping their chest King Kong style is that they're irritated by this. But if so, I can only say they're not reading the room. I don't think that this is, you know, a very clever sort of Chinese strategy, and I think, but I do think that it is very, and because it's very risky, and I think if in the case of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, I would find it, you know, I think you would. I mean, German press has already been saying, you know, if that happened, we would need to help the Taiwanese. You probably didn't expect that, but that is what I've been reading, and I tend to agree. So complicated times ahead.
On that very sobering note, and I appreciate, I think that a lot of Americans are feeling at least some amount of relief at the acceleration of the distribution of the vaccine and some amount of normalcy. And
me too. Can I just say that? Thank you, America, twice.
But I appreciate your message of concern and great concern. Is there anything online that you would like to direct our audience to in terms of follow-up for information on what we've discussed today?
Well, I mean, there are, Brookings isn't the only think tank in Washington, D.C. There are a lot of places in Washington that have been writing about this. But I will say that Brookings is also, it has to be said, lost about a dozen folks to the administration, and really, really good people. But yes, we have been doing a lot of events and writing about this. And if you're interested in what I write, I have a monthly column in the Financial Times, which this is a secret. We're allowed to reprint, to relink to on my expert page without the paywall. Just saying.
Secret. Good info.
Yes. I would say watch this space. I mean, I feel we're going to do an event on Thursday morning with some of the folks who've been sanctioned in Europe. You can listen to that if you want. And I am fairly certain that we will have more occasion to talk about these things in the coming weeks and months.
I'm certain.
And do you have any books or articles that we should direct people to? Are you planning on public?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I have a piece called "The Singular Chancellor" in the next edition of Foreign Affairs, which hits the newsstands on April 20th, and that's a look back on the Merkel legacy. And otherwise, again, I'm very grateful to have this monthly column because that allows me to sort of address stuff as it arises. And I occasionally also write for Foreign Policy or for the Washington Post. Again, that'll all be on my website in chronological order if anybody wants to look. And maybe if you're interested in the larger questions about Germany as a foreign and security policy actor, or more generally how it developed after reunification, you might want to take a look at my 2019 Brookings essay, German Lessons, which will give you quite a lot of reference material to go with. Okay.
Terrific. So I want to
thank you so much for having me. This was lovely.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you for giving us this extra time, joining us this evening. For those that are, there's quite a few people still hanging with us. Check our website for upcoming events. Join our mailing list at worldaffairsforum.org. And a final reminder, if for those that have not, sign up for membership to support our programming. Thank you all again, Tom, Frank, for helping put this together. Everybody have a wonderful evening and stay safe.
Likewise, be well, get vaccinated.
Absolutely.
And have a lovely spring. Thank you for the invitation.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.